My name's Matt Mowers. I'm the founding board member of the EU-US Forum. On behalf of myself and Joe Grogan, our other board member with the forum who are here, welcome to Vienna on this beautiful weather, beautiful day, and we couldn't be having this conversation at a more pressing and important time. We have seen bureaucrats, whether they're in Brussels or Washington, D.C., working overtime these days to try to restrict free speech and to censor more free speech online, to implement energy policies which are jeopardizing national security, to implement radical environmental agendas which are trying to run out family farmers, and to actually ignore the crisis of immigration and the causes it's having and the impact it's having on everyday citizens. And so back in March, we started the EU-US Forum in order to be a voice and a check on the policies coming out of Brussels, and to also inform Americans about what is at stake. Because so many of the ideas that we see on the American left actually originate here in Europe. And whether it's socialized medicine policies that would destroy the medical system and the healthcare delivery system, whether it's those radical environmental policies, many of them start here. And we've actually seen just in the last 24 hours this shutdown of free speech where you actually have government officials want to dictate what you're allowed to think and what you're allowed to say. Whether it was the policy that we saw in the UK just the other day that started saying that you could not utilize and express your free speech on social media, otherwise you might be inciting an incident, to a commissioner from the EU Commission last night sending a letter to Elon Musk, the owner of X, warning him about a live stream he was about to have with President Trump. These are the types of things that they are trying to do to indoctrinate an entire population right now into a liberal ideology, and that's why we exist, to fight back. And so we thought it was so important to have this event today. When we kicked off in March, we had a great event in Rome. We then had a follow-up panel in Washington, D.C. We actually invested almost $1 million into advertising around the EU election, parliament elections that happened in June, in order to actually give voice to a number of those issues we talked about, and we saw the results. We saw some of the record increases in conservative members of parliament elected. We saw the collapse of many of the parties on the left, except the problem is this. Brussels is still ignoring the will of the voters because they refuse to actually change any of the leadership that is emanating out of Brussels, despite the fact that the voters of Europe and the European Union sent a loud and clear message of a new direction that they wanted, a direction that involved stronger border controls, decentralized control so people could live their lives, a protection of free speech. They've ignored that because they want to hold on to the political power. And so we thought it would be great to have Guy Benson and Ambassador Rick Grenell with us today. You know, Guy Benson, of course, is a Fox News contributor, has the Guy Benson Show, is the political editor of Town Hall. And Ambassador Rick Grenell, someone I got to know when I served in the State Department under President Trump. Not only did he serve as a remarkable ambassador to Germany, where he told some really tough truths, including some tough truths to Angela Merkel about what would happen if they didn't diversify and break away from Russian energy and adopted this Green New Deal style energy policy. Some tough truths about standing up and getting serious about the interconnectedness to China. He was then appointed as a presidential envoy by President Trump directly to handle for Kosovo and Serbia peace negotiations and talks, to have an ongoing, long-lasting peace discussions there, and was able to actually foster incredible progress made in order to get them to actually work together and more intertwined more of their economic relationship as well. And so we're honored that they're both here with us today, two amazing individuals who want to protect free speech and the great way of life that we all know we can have both in Europe and the United States. Our good friends Guy Benson and Ambassador Rick Grenell.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I am Guy. This is Ambassador Grenell. It's good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So,
be here in Vienna.
It's just a beautiful time to be here, although I want to come back at Christmas, I think. I've heard it's just incredible at Christmas time. So a lot of what we want to discuss today is what a second Trump term might look like in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the EU specifically. But before we get to that, before we get way ahead of ourselves, I think an appropriate first threshold question is, will there be a second Trump term? Because you might know we're in the middle of an election cycle. It's been a little bit wild, maybe the most eventful month and a half that I can remember in an American election cycle, covering this for a couple decades. So let's just start there. Handicap this election for us. How confident are you that Donald Trump's going to win?
I like the first part of the question where it was just an assumption that we won, which would be amazing. We've got a lot of work to do before then. I'm certainly not saying we are absolutely going to win. I think we are. I think that the mechanics are there. But it's a long road to get there. And obviously it goes through Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And so we've got a lot of states to win. In terms of just like handicapping it, I'd rather be us than them. And one of the reasons why is that I think the American people now know, they feel the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. They see a massive war in Europe. They see a massive war in the Middle East. They see our open borders. They see the numbers of illegal immigrants that have crossed into our country. And more importantly, I think they feel the effects of inflation every single week when they put gas in their car, when they buy groceries. I can't tell you how many people say to me constantly, I'm voting just on the grocery issue alone. When you go to the grocery store, it's shocking. Now look, I can afford it, but I'm shocked when I go through and I see just how much things are. It wasn't like that under President Trump. And so people feel that, and the election was incredibly close last time. So I think that the public has already decided that they would rather have closed borders, no wars, and cheaper gas and groceries. And so I tend to think it's almost over, to be honest. I feel like people have seen the effects of both presidents. And look, this is a very unique case in that we're not talking about a politician promising what they might do in the future, and then the media saying, oh, this would be great, and having economists say, yeah, this would work. It's literally the Vice President of the United States who, by her own account, was the last person to leave the room on every big decision with Joe Biden. And so the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris team, we see what they've given us. And we also know what President Trump gave us.
I would agree that if it were still Joe Biden running as the Democratic nominee, the elected nominee of their party who they threw out, the election would be pretty close to over. Donald Trump seemed to be very much on a glide path to victory. But since they did this switch and Kamala Harris is now the new nominee, the media is very excited about it.
Yeah.
Democrats have become much more energized, and the polling has closed, and she's taken the lead slightly in these polling averages, which aren't necessarily determinative, of course, as we've seen in the past. But it has, at least as an outside observer, and I know that you were not officially part of the Trump campaign, but you're sort of unofficially helping, and you're close with the former president. From my perspective in the media, it seems like the campaign has been a little bit flat-footed, maybe a little spooked by this change. They were planning to run against this guy, and now it's something different. Do you agree with that? Do you think that they're having to pivot in a way that maybe they're getting around to a little slowly?
Well, we certainly have had to pivot, but I don't think that we're spooked in any way, because most of us figured Joe Biden is not going to make it. We could see that. Even though the media was denying it and Democrats were denying it and we were being mocked for bringing it up, it was inevitable that he was going to step back. And I think we all assumed they're not going to have a messy, quick primary of some sort. They're just going to nullify all the votes and have a bunch of elites get in a room and pick somebody, and they're going to pick Kamala because they can't shove her off the stage. She's been the vice president. And so, yeah, it's been a big change. I think the excitement is from the media that absolutely already had a candidate, but now they get to be excited about somebody new. And the Democrats showing up at the rallies, they're big rallies, but the reality for me is that all of my Democrat friends were always going to vote for Joe Biden reluctantly. Now they're excited to wear their Kamala shirt, but I don't think that they got any new votes. They haven't picked up any new votes. The independents, people on the fence, are still leaning Trump. Independents actually are going for Trump. And it goes back to, I think, a war, grocery prices, multiple wars, and the open border.
Before we talk more about a potential Trump second term. His opponent, we've mentioned her a few times, the Vice President, Kamala Harris. For those people who are just getting acquainted with her a little bit, overseas or even at home, what is your sense of her political character, her political background? She's California, you're California, you run somewhat in similar circles and know a lot of the same people. What's her reputation out on the West Coast, and then what does that become in terms of her reputation until 3.5 weeks ago in Washington, D.C.?
Well, first of all, California is by far the most far-left state, as you know this, in all of the United States. And Kamala Harris is by far the most woke Democrat in California. She is radical by her own words. I mean, she's questioned red meat. She doesn't think we should have red meat because it's bad for the environment. She is on, video saying you got to be woke. You actually got to be really woke. You got to be more woke than anybody else. She's on video saying, I want to ban fracking. I want to get rid of ICE. Cops don't help on the streets. She's literally the most radical nominee America has ever seen. She's a San Francisco radical. And so I just don't see the American people voting for that. Now, it's our job on the Trump team to make sure that we play her own words. And that's what we have to do, is we have to remind America exactly who she is. I actually think that there's no way that America is going to vote for this. We're already on a hangover from the DEI woke stuff. We tried it. We went all in. I do think that the rest of the world is kind of trying it in some forms, and they don't like it either. But we in America went all in, and I think most people will say, we got to turn back around. This is a disaster. She represents sanctuary cities. Remember, she pushed for that as Attorney General in California. And every possible crazy radical left, gender ideology, DEI, all of that stuff, she not only embraces, but she's on video embracing. And so I think her own words are going to sink her.
Her official nominating convention is next week in Chicago. It'll be sort of a 4-day infomercial for this newly minted ticket, Harris and her running mate, Tim Walz from Minnesota. There are at least some expectations for some protests in the streets over the Israel issue. The Democratic Party has been somewhat fractured on certain foreign policy questions recently. What is, as best as you can tell, what is the Kamala Harris worldview on foreign policy? Because we haven't gotten too many details from her really on anything, but particularly in this realm.
Look, she's not interested in international policy. She's not even really interested in domestic policy, and I say that honestly. She is a master of Democrat politics. She's obviously climbed the ladder in a very rough way in California, where it's all Democrats. And she's been able to use sharp elbows and a DEI-style reputation to say, this is my turn, and no one is going to challenge me. Now, we have in California a system where the straight white male at the top, Gavin Newsom, is handing out little DEI jobs and creating this kind of dependency, crumbs-like, to all the different groups. I find it extremely condescending. And I think they're going to have to justify that. Kamala's foreign policy, I think, the vice president's foreign policy, is just going to be whatever the woke left mob within the Democratic Party wants. So you see it playing out when it comes to Israel, when it comes to the Palestinian territories, and how she wants to approach, the fact that we have Americans held hostage. She doesn't talk about the Americans held hostage. She doesn't talk about crushing Hamas, the terrorist organization. She never talks about Iran. I just don't know how you talk about this issue unfolding in Israel if you don't talk about the fact that the Biden-Harris administration funded this. They funded the war. I'm sorry, but they did billions of dollars in sanctions relief, in credit, and in cash to Iran, and Iran then funded the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Those are just the facts. And so, when we talk to Arab Americans in Detroit or anywhere else, we tell them, what do you expect when you fund Iran? They agree. They think that it's a terrible thing to fund Iran. And they understand that there's now a war instead of peace that Donald Trump brought them. And we say very clearly, Donald Trump brought Arab-Israeli peace agreements. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris brought war and hostages.
So Kamala Harris is campaigning as the underdog. She describes herself as the underdog based on what you said a few moments ago. For now, at least, you agree with that. Let's now get way ahead of ourselves and talk about a hypothetical second Trump administration. There was a report out there that right around the time of the Republican convention in Milwaukee, Trump had a few people on his short list for vice president, and he called them one by one to tell them that they didn't get the job, and then finally called J.D. Vance and said, it's you. And when he called Doug Burgum, who's the governor of North Dakota, he'd been on the short list, he reportedly referred to him as Mr. Secretary on the phone call, sort of a wink at what a role might look like for Governor Burgum in a Trump term. When you call President Trump, does he ever refer to you as Mr. Secretary or anything like that?
No, look, when I talk to the president, it's about, things that are happening right now or politics, Michigan, Wisconsin. I know the media and you guys love to speculate about who's where and what's going to happen. Honestly, we're totally focused on the campaign. And anyone who's not focused on the campaign is not in the universe of talking to President Trump. He doesn't do that. He's somebody who is not going to take kindly to someone trying to talk about some job or appointment or who's getting what. Mm-hmm. He wants to literally focus on the fight, the daily fight.
Do you speak with him pretty frequently about this stuff?
Yeah, I don't ever talk about my conversations with the president, but suffice to say, yes.
Okay. And let's say hypothetically, because I can speculate, let's say hypothetically you were offered a high-level position again within his administration, maybe even a higher-level position. Is that something that you would definitely accept? Do you see more public service potentially in your future? Depending on the gig, how would you feel about a Senate confirmation process? Because you never keep your opinions to yourself. You've said and tweeted some caustic things that could become interesting in a Senate setting. Do you ever think about that?
No, I really don't. In 2013, I got cancer. I got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, deadly cancer, stage 4. And while I never want to go through it again, while I thought it was the most miserable thing, I am a better, more comfortable human being because of cancer. And what I mean by that is I don't really care what people think of me. I know I'm a kind person. I know I'm a generous person. I love my family. I love my friends. And that's what life is about for me, is no regrets. If you wake up every morning and you say to yourself, did I make this world a little bit better? Am I kind? Am I, doing the right thing? Then I think you sleep at night. And so I'm really happy with life giving me another day every single day. I'm cancer-free, but it's, I think, something that your perspective changes. So all in all, I'm going to live and fight and do exactly what I think is the right thing to do. I do love to hold reporters to account. I think they dish out criticism all day and they freak out when you give them one piece of criticism. They literally are babies about it. And I enjoy that. I actually enjoy showing their hypocrisy and watching them squirm because they're not held to account, Guy. We see media constantly just saying their advocacy and pretending to be unbiased. I actually think it's ruining democracy when we have a bunch of people who climb up on this mantle and say, I'm the arbiter of the truth. I'm somebody who's going to call balls and strikes, and then they don't. They are actually advocates. I think it's shameful, and they should be called out. I think that's speaking truth to power. And if they're going to dish it out, they should be able to take it. And then lastly, I'll just say, I believe President Trump is going to win. And if President Trump wins this year, he's also going to have a Republican Senate. So he's going to have his choices get through.
On the confirmation hypothetical there, let me ask you, since you brought this up and Matt had mentioned it in our introduction, there was this little contretemps back home in the last 24 hours. Donald Trump did this lengthy interview or conversation with Elon Musk on Twitter or X, and it went a couple hours. I read that there were 1 million people who watched, and leading up to it, there was a lot of hand-wringing. In the American press, you saw someone on CNN expressing concern that Donald Trump would be able to say whatever he wanted to say, which is literally free speech, and they were concerned about that. We had a Washington Post reporter ask the White House, ask the press secretary at the White House, could the president or the administration do anything to stop this conversation? And then there was this missive, this letter fired off by some EU, commissar, almost threatening, sort of saber-rattling about free speech and harmful content and that sort of thing surrounding this conversation. The Trump campaign put out quite a statement in response to that EU official, calling the EU broadly enemies of free speech. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course they are enemies of free speech. Look, what's happening, first of all, the two Americans talking about what's going on is, talking about the election, is all about freedom of speech. If someone is going to try to have a chilling effect to say they shouldn't be able to speak freely because there's hate speech or misinformation, first of all, this misinformation nonsense has got to stop. It's not misinformation. Sometimes it's someone's opinion, and the best way to confront something that you don't agree with is to speak out and give your facts and let people decide. There should never be a government agency or entity deciding to stop dissent because they think they know what's right. You know who does that? China. If the EU wants to have their own version of the internet, like China, they want to create a special internet where people don't have freedom of expression because they think that somehow it's a bad thing. So the government is going to stop what's happening on the internet. They are no different than creating a system like China. And I think the EU's got to be very careful of what they're doing. Now, we get that they don't have the same freedom of speech and First Amendment rights like America does. But what they have done is interfere in our election by trying to have a chilling effect on what can be said and describing Donald Trump's policies as misinformation or bad or negative. By doing that, that's what Russia does with propaganda. And so I think that we're getting into this area, into the EU, where Brussels and others are beginning to mimic some of the terrible systems that we've all in the West been calling out. It's a wake-up call for Europeans to stand up and have their voices be heard and say, this is unacceptable. We're not going to follow the path of China or Russia and create this system. The governments and the entities of government in the European Union and throughout Europe are getting way too powerful. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of when the people have had enough, they fight back. And I'll finish with this. I'm sure we'll get into U.S.-German relations, but we have to remember that the EU became weaker and smaller with Brexit because they couldn't get their rules-based system down. Their reaction to immigration and their lack of their willingness to really tackle legal versus illegal immigration and have rules and enforce the rules, that created a system where they're smaller and weaker today. We don't want to see that. And so I think it's a reminder to all of the governments within Europe that they've got to be more for the people and not have this power attitude that somehow they know what's best and they're going to create an internet where government and big elites decide what's safe and what's not safe.
So you mentioned China, Russia, Germany. I hope to get to all three at some point. Let's start with Germany, where you had your post. You spent your time in Berlin. How did you see the U.S.-German relationship evolving or devolving, or however you want to describe it, over time since you left Berlin? And what would the folks in Berlin be wise to start thinking about more seriously if, in fact, you're right and Trump's going to win?
Well, look, Germany is an amazing country. I love it very much, and I have so many friends there. The German business community is most like the American business community. There's no other two countries that are most alike. If you take any large German-based company, Lufthansa has 15,000 American employees. BMW, Daimler, Bayer, all of these great German companies have massive numbers of Americans who work for them. So in many ways, you can't really pull them apart. You can't really say one's a German company and one's not. And that's the argument that so many of the German CEOs made to me during the Trump administration, is to say, look, we're acting like one. German CEOs will unequivocally tell me, we don't like what's going on in German government. We want them to mind their own business, but we're afraid of them because they're vindictive. And so you've got a German business community that's very nervous. I don't think it's that dissimilar from the American business community. Many American employers are afraid of the American government. We got to stop that. I think we've got to have a healthy private sector that creates the jobs and that the government is not trying to push back. But just take the top issues that I faced in Germany for President Trump. One was Iran sanctions, and we went through all of the German companies and just said, we're not telling you that you can't do business in a certain place, but we are telling you that you're not going to be able to do business in Iran and in the United States. You got to choose one. And every single one of them said, hey, we're choosing the United States. So they would stop doing business in Iran. They didn't like it. The media complained. They thought that I was heavy-handed because I was trying to squeeze Iran from getting money. I think we were right. I think the German business community needs to recognize, the German government and Europeans, that it was the right thing to do to squeeze Iran and to make them a pariah, an international pariah, and to not give them money. Look what they've done. They've created this massive war when they got money. So we were right on that. The second issue that we faced was Nord Stream 2. And you can go back and look, I was pretty mocked by the German media for being too belligerent about Nord Stream 2. And, I was direct. I'm always direct, but I'm a nice guy, never mean-spirited. I just am direct. And what we said was to the Germans, this is not a good idea. You're going to allow Russia to leverage over you by having Nord Stream 2. And, for whatever reason, Merkel, trying to avoid the Green Party, she triangulated on those issues. She decided to take up all of the Green Party issues on energy and locked Germany into a really bad position where they needed this Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia. And Merkel would say, you Americans don't understand our relationship with Russia. We can control them. We have a different relationship with them. And she was wrong about that. And,
Did they acknowledge that they got it wrong, do you think? Or?
First of all, not enough, not directly. Some are saying, we got a different policy now, and that's the most that they would go to. But I think it's really important to tie this in is that, Chancellor Merkel begged President Trump to drop the Trump sanctions on Putin's pipeline, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We had sanctions on it. It never became operational under the Trump administration. We were adamant, and we took a lot of hits from the media for being mean-spirited about this, even from the U.S. media. Merkel kept pushing, and we kept saying no. When Joe Biden came into office, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were lobbied by Chancellor Merkel, and she made the argument, drop these sanctions. Let's get the sanctions dropped on Nord Stream 2 because it's not good, it's not going to be helpful. If you go back, and I keep trying to push reporters to do this, and so far I haven't seen anyone do it, but if you go back to that conversation in the Senate and you pick up the floor speeches of Democrat senators who are talking about why they're dropping the Nord Stream 2 sanctions, the theme is because this is going to be bad for our relations with Russia. This is sticking them in the eye. It's inevitable. What are we doing that? We need to listen to our partners. Why aren't we treating our allies better? It's all of that. It's a mess. When they dropped those sanctions on Nord Stream 2 and they gave Putin his pipeline, he saw weakness. I have been arguing that it is worse than Afghanistan. Most people will say Afghanistan was the moment that people saw the Biden flop on Afghanistan, was the moment that so many people said, you know, the world sees Joe Biden as weak. I don't think so. I think Putin saw the dropping of Nord Stream 2 sanctions, Merkel getting her gift of dropping the sanctions. I believe that was the moment that Putin decided, I'm going to go into Ukraine. Now is my time. It's Joe Biden and Merkel all over again, like Obama and Merkel, and now is my time. And I just say to my friends in Europe, just look back. You mocked us on Nord Stream 2. You mocked us on Iran sanctions. You mocked us on the 2% for paying the NATO share. Those were the three issues that they mocked Donald Trump the most. They were resistant. They were wrong on all three of those. And I would argue we have a massive war in Europe with no end in sight because of those mistakes.
Okay, so let's talk about that war. Trump, when he's asked about it, his line typically is, well, it never would have happened if I were president. He obviously believes that. I think you believe that as well. Some people may not be as sold, but that's his first line. But the second question would be, okay, well, then what? He said, well, I would get it resolved very quickly.
Yeah.
He says he won't just do it, it'll be very quick.
Yeah.
What does that look like exactly? What would Trump policy vis-a-vis Ukraine look like on day one or first 100 days of a new administration?
Well, first of all, you'll just have to forgive me because I'm a little bit annoyed that I have to answer questions about how are you going to get us out of these wars? We didn't have the wars under Donald Trump. And so now what you're asking me is, how do you dig out Biden and Harris after they've literally ruined two parts of our world with massive wars? Now what are you going to do? And then everybody holds us to say, well, that's not a very good idea. Yeah.
But he wants power.
We've got a bad idea and a terrible idea, and you're asking me to choose. So I'm a little bit annoyed that I'm now having to bail out Joe Biden and Kamala Harris here to say, what would you do? First of all, we wouldn't be in this mess because of the credibility of Donald Trump. There is a difference between a threat and a credible threat. There's a very big difference. Donald Trump has a credible threat. I remember one time speaking with Chancellor Merkel where she said to me, you know, the problem with your president is that I can't figure him out. We just don't know what he's going to do next. And I can remember sitting there thinking, don't smile too much, because this is an amazing moment. And I said, you know, Madam Chancellor, with all due respect, we in America love this because we want people to not be able to predict us, because that is a credible threat, whether it's a credible threat of sanctions, a credible threat of isolation, or a credible threat of military action. I think it's really important to be able to have that credibility. Donald Trump has that credibility. People know when he says things, he means it. So when he says to two sides, no matter what the issue, a war or car tariffs or anything, when he says, you better figure it out or there are going to be consequences, everyone knows that's not a white paper to the Secretary of Treasury to come up with some ideas in 3 months. That means tomorrow morning there's something.
And it's also not Joe Biden saying don't, right? That's a non-credible threat, clearly, because he said don't a lot,
Yeah.
and then people did.
Yeah. So the reality is that the president is going to solve it fast because he's going to say to both sides, knock it off. We've got to solve this. And if you don't, there are going to be consequences. Everybody knows that's going to happen the next day. Consequences are coming. They're going to be terrible, and they're going to be quick.
Consequences for the Russians and for the Ukrainians?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, I'll just give you an example. When Pastor Brunson was held against his will in Turkey, and we tried at different levels to get Pastor Brunson returned, when it bubbled up to President Trump, picked up the phone, and he called President Erdogan, and he said, return Pastor Brunson by tomorrow, or I'll ruin your economy. People knew he was serious. There were going to be some actions immediately that would do something to the economy. And so Pastor Brunson was returned the next day. And so I think that people understand the credible threat. And you know what I love about President Trump's credible threats is that he does them to keep peace. And I've talked about this before, but you know, peace through strength, we hear about that all the time. But peace through strength is the anthem and the success story of the State Department, not the Pentagon, not just the Pentagon. Of course, we need a very strong military that has behind us that threat. But when you have peace through the threat, it's because there were diplomats that were there to push through and have a peaceful negotiation. Now, we have to do them together, but too many times in America, we just reflexively go to the Pentagon and we ignore the State Department. We close embassies, we evacuate people. This administration, the Biden-Harris administration, has evacuated more embassies than any other president in the history of the world. It's terrible. And I know too many career Foreign Service officers who want to solve problems. They don't want to be evacuated. They want to be there and they want to do the work. And so we've got to be able to do that, and we need tougher diplomats. We need the State Department to be in the game.
And what does that look like when it comes to Ukraine? Because a lot of Ukrainians don't want to give any concessions to the Russians. The Russians started this. It's a war of aggression. I think a lot of people from the outside want the war, of course, to end. There's been a lot of dying. The Russians, at the very least, would probably need some sort of fig leaf to feel like they've gotten something out of it if they're willing to sort of end this horrible misadventure that they started. What would the contours of that sort of look like, conceivably?
This is the first time someone's ever asked me a question about how to, here's a question on Ukraine and it's more about peace. Usually they say, well, how do you feel about more funding for the war? And I'm like, that's the question? Either I have to be...
You can answer that too, though.
I either have to be for more funding or not for funding. Look, I'm a 12-year State Department person. You're not going to hear me talking about acting like I'm part of the Pentagon. I don't want war. I don't want to fund war. Let's let other people answer the question about funding war. I believe the President of the United States needs to have two strong voices sitting in front of him or her when they're in the Oval Office. One is the military side, the Pentagon. The other is the diplomacy. Is, great, let's be prepared at the Pentagon, but not now. We've got some other things to do first. And you have to have a very tough, mean Secretary of State who is saying, wait.
Like someone who's direct, might describe himself as direct.
But my point is that right now we have a Secretary of State that will tell you that culinary diplomacy is how everything starts. And if you look at his social media feed, he's doing things that you're just like, do you not realize that there are two wars? And this goes to the point where, we heard from the Biden team, including Anthony Blinken, for at least 30 days before the Ukraine war. The Russians are coming, the Russians are going to invade, the Russians are coming. I find it to be really immoral that the Secretary of State, who has his own plane, When he heard absolutely the Russians are coming to invade in Ukraine into Europe, we know they're coming, we have evidence, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Why didn't he get on the plane and go gather all of the foreign ministers in Europe and get to Moscow and say, no, let's try something? The same thing with Israel. When you know that there's a crisis, you've got to be there to solve it. But you look and, Anthony Blinken goes every once in a while to the region and has another meeting, and then it's a failure. I just feel like we got to have somebody who's much more direct, who talks about the consequences. And maybe it's because he's got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that are not that serious, and that's the problem as well. But I want to see more action when it comes to peace deals and trying to solve things peacefully.
Okay. Another way to come at the Ukraine question is through NATO. You talked about the minimum, spending requirements and commitments. That was a theme for President Trump, candidate Trump, President Trump. Is that going to again come to the fore, do you think, where NATO allies, a lot of them have now reached that level? Is that maybe something he's going to bang on again?
Well, look, they're all not there on their 2%, and as we've always said, 2% is the floor, not the ceiling. And I think we could get into, I'm going to get myself into trouble here, but we could get into the claim that the Germans are paying 2%. I don't believe that they are. If you look at those numbers, spending on climate change is not part of your defense. There's a whole bunch of things in there that are not legitimately spent. And even though NATO said, oh yes, we can kind of see a way that this is going to be bent into your spending.
You think it's fudged?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, look, I know it's fudged because I sat and listened to Merkel, and she said it's impossible for us to do it until 2030. And then all of a sudden with Joe Biden, it was just like, oh, we've achieved it in 2024. It's like, really? Because Merkel was telling us that it was going to take another 6 years. And the socialists who are in charge suddenly were like, yep, we did it. Here's the numbers. Let's move on. We got the 2%. So I feel like my friends in the press corps in Europe and in Germany need to dig into those numbers. But it's a long answer for your point of, yes, they are increasing their defense spending. Thank God. We have to constantly remind people that the American national debt is $35 trillion. Think about that, $35 trillion. And we've got countries in Europe that keep expanding the NATO tent and saying, let's have this country come in and let's have that country come in. I just don't believe that we should be expanding NATO at all until every single current member, is paying at least 2% and fully on board with the current threats.
So you think the recent NATO expansion in Scandinavia was a bad idea?
Yes, I would not have let any country, I would have advised the president to say, don't let any country in that expands the umbrella when the current ones are not paying their fair share. Why do that to the American people? Why expand the tent and make the American people pay even more? I think about my mom, who is worked her whole life, small pension, on Social Security, doing great, but she's not wealthy. And I have to say, do we need to take more from my mom to allow another country to have the umbrella when I look and all of the things that we're spending on, and I say no. I don't think it's fair.
On the umbrella, do you believe President Trump would be absolutely committed to the Article 5 requirements?
Look, we get this question all the time, and I know where it comes from is the question that was asked of him. We only talk about the answer. Very few people go back to the question. The question that President Trump was answering was this: what would you say to countries who signed the Wales Pledge in 2014 to pay 2%, but then said, no, we're not going to do it? There's only one answer. If a country literally says, we know what the rules are, but we're going to break the rules, and there's nothing you can do about it, That was the hypothetical question. My second part is just to simply say, we know exactly what Trump is going to do with NATO because we saw it for 4 years. He didn't leave NATO. He made NATO stronger. I could sit here and argue that the person who cares more about an organization is the one who wants to fix it, get it focused, and give it more money. And that's exactly what President Trump did. He said, look, it's not great right now. You're not focused on the current threats. And let's get the capabilities issues sorted out. And you know, the capabilities is how the 2% is. I mean, some people don't quite understand, but it's to be honest, it's kind of like a wedding registry. NATO puts out what they need for a war, potential war, and countries sign up and say, yeah, we're capable, we can do this, we'll bring this to the war, we'll bring this to the wedding. But you gotta bring your gift. You can't just say, we think you deserve a toaster, and so I'll get that toaster later on.
Sitting in the shopping cart.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to actually show up and be able to bring the toaster. And so on the capabilities front, I think we've got to be very real about who is signing up and are they actually capable of bringing what they say that they were going to bring. And then on the other issue that President Trump, I think, was completely focused on was the current threats. You know, cyber is a big threat right now. There's so many other issues. And do we think that NATO is ready to tackle all threats? And I think that's a question.
Based on your answer a moment ago, my guess is you'd be a pretty hard no on expanding NATO to include Ukraine, because that's a conversation that, of course, some people have been having.
Yeah. Look, I mean, these are difficult discussions, and certainly you're going to have to look at all of these issues. What I've looked at for Ukraine, I have not talked to President Trump, this is just my personal opinion. When you look at Minsk or Minsk II, there are some good elements in there, but they obviously it fell short, it collapsed because the Russians signed up and obviously weren't that serious about their commitments. And so you're going to have an enforcement mechanism. You're going to have to look at all of the issues. But I think that in Minsk, there was this kind of good concept that we should build upon, which is territorial integrity with autonomous zones, autonomous regions. I think that's a creative way. Obviously, it's about enforcement and it's about the details, but I think that's a good start.
For an off-ramp, potentially, diplomatic off-ramp.
Yeah, the diplomats need to be talking about this issue. More than a year ago, the Chinese came up with a peace plan. And I'm very clear-eyed about China. But that peace plan was decent. And it should have been part of a discussion immediately. It wasn't perfect. I wouldn't have accepted it. But it was a good start. And even Zelensky's first words about it, I saw this within the hour of the peace plan being announced. His first words were, wow, the Chinese believe in territorial integrity for Ukraine. He wanted to engage on that, and the White House was like, no, be quiet, war, more funding for war, and it's all this war talk. And I just thought, wow, the diplomats have completely been shoved off the stage. And if I were a European, I'd be furious because they're playing with war in my neighborhood. And the only discussion we're talking about is how much more money are you going to give to keep this war going? And there's no one who is being belligerent about a peace plan. And we need that.
Clear-eyed on China is what you just said. What does that mean from a US-EU perspective? When you were in Berlin, I mean, you could sometimes look around and see, I would imagine a lot of folks maybe not that serious about the threat from China. Yeah. There's some of that in the US as well, although there's some, I'd say, bipartisanship that's growing on that question. Have you seen the EU moving in a positive or negative direction, in your view, when it comes to China? Because everyone's, of course, immediately focused on Russia and Ukraine. That makes sense. The Middle East as well, but there's this looming China issue.
I think it's a perfect way to say it, is looming. I mean, because I was acting DNI, I'll say it this way. I don't let TikTok in my house. If you've got TikTok, I make you leave it outside my house. I've seen what happens. So it's really hard to tell people who don't have the same threat or feel the same threat why they should be vigilant. But I think that there's a variety of things that we can do peacefully as allies, Western allies, to come together to blunt the communist tactics that China pushes forward. And that requires all of us acting together. And I think that you kind of referred to this, that on both sides of the Atlantic we have skeptics and people who want to engage. Certainly there's a lot of companies that want to make money and they think this is a great, big, huge operation and we should allow that to happen. But I think the overwhelming evidence is that China hasn't been a great member of the WTO. It hasn't worked out. We engaged them and said, hey, well, why don't you come into the WTO? Because we thought we would see greater respect for human rights and democracy and the rule of law and all that. And by all measures, it's gotten worse. And so I think we've got to join hands and tackle this together. I have heard through some of my European friends that they're nervous about if the Trump administration comes in again and there's too much negotiation on car tariffs and other issues, that somehow they're going to think that their future lies with China rather than the West. I think obviously that's a terrible read. Europe and America should always be together. We should be reflexively Western. And I believe that requires the Europeans to get more serious about being reflexively West. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done there.
So in the time that we have left, I have two more questions, and they're pretty broad, so feel free to go wherever you want with them. Number one, I know that you speak on a regular basis with world leaders, heads of state, that sort of thing. I'd imagine you have conversations that go something like this. If Trump wins again and he's president again, what should I do to prepare myself, my country, for what the world will look like under American leadership with Donald Trump at the helm? Broad strokes, what is the advice that you would give generically, whether it's Macron, you go down the list?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple, and I do get this question a lot, not just from world leaders, but from all sorts of people, and the media constantly asking what is the world going to be like if Trump wins. I push back and I just say, you saw him for 4 years. I believe that when America puts itself first, that the world benefits, because we are not a nation that conquers and takes. We are a nation that establishes rule of law, respect, democracy, capitalism. Those rules are what everybody wants. They don't always abide by them, but those are the international rules that are the best, that make the best system. And so I'm really proud of America when we put ourselves first, because we establish rules that benefit everybody else. America first doesn't mean America alone. It means we create a system that's fair, and then there's kind of the coalition of the willing on different issues. And I believe that world leaders know that. They want that. I've been in tens of thousands of diplomatic meetings. I spent 8 years at the UN. 193 countries are at the UN. And when you're there for 8 years with 193 countries, you watch how China negotiates and Russia negotiates and the Latins and the Africans, and you really get a great lesson. Every single country puts itself first, and in a diplomatic meeting, every single country asks the United States to do something. Every single time. And so we have to recognize that if we don't put ourselves first, we're the only country that doesn't. We shouldn't apologize for that. We do have to articulate, when we put ourselves first, why that benefits the world. I believe it does. and I believe the arguments can be made.
And so finally, sort of on that theme, your answer back is, oh, well, don't think too hard about Trump 2.0 because you've seen Trump 1.0 for 4 years. But I think most people understand if Trump wins, it'll be such a dramatic departure in a lot of ways from Biden and Harris. But will there be noticeable differences between the first Trump administration and the second one in terms of policy, in terms of
I don't think so.
priorities, in terms of personnel?
Well, of course, during personnel, people will be different just because the timing is different. But I think you know exactly who Donald Trump is. He's somebody who doesn't like war, doesn't want war, puts America first, wants to talk about economic growth and prosperity. When I did Kosovo-Serbia negotiations, what the president said to me is, don't do politics, talk about economic growth. This is what's going to keep people in the region. This is what's going to create jobs, good paying jobs for young people. This is the hope that they need. And so when I got the two sides together, I said, look, let's brainstorm here. How do we move things together? But every single time you bring up something that is political, I'm going to reject it. And I'm going to say, nope, that's politics. We don't need to sit around and try to get two countries to like each other. This whole idea, this is very controversial, the Europeans love to put all of their eggs in one basket about mutual recognition between Kosovo and Serbia. Why do we care if they mutually recognize each other? Really, honestly, if you don't like me or I don't like you, we should demand that you have open borders, and what I mean by economic borders, not open borders, but an economy that is free-flowing across borders, say it that way, and growth and capitalism, and that you try to get to the point where you have fair trade. And I think that creates the system of teaching people, maybe it's going to take 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, to begin to say, oh, I'm trading with these people and I have a good life and I don't have to hate them simply because I was told to hate them. And these are difficult issues to do in Kosovo and Serbia. And I've said to my friends on both sides, look, I get my family was not impacted like your family. I get that I'm going to sound very insensitive when I say, don't look backwards, look forward, and talk about the economic growth. I get that you're looking at me and you say, you don't know, you haven't been impacted. I totally understand that. But you have to understand that I have a little value in trying to get you to look to the future. Because your kids don't want to just sit around and talk about mutual recognition and politics. They want to know that they can stay here because there's a good job and they're going to have a family here and you're going to get to see your grandkids because they didn't move to Germany or Hungary or Poland. And so what I tried to do is to say to people, we got to reject this NGO class that wants white papers and mutual recognition and sitting around a table and fighting about words. No, that's not important. What is important is getting people on a path so that they have jobs, good paying jobs, and are prosperous and safe. And that is, I think, the theme of what Donald Trump wants to do. And that's what the vision of President Trump's second term, God willing, that he's elected and implements those policies again.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thanks, Guy.